introduction there. Sorry, the title was a bit of a mouthful. Let's start. Okay, so what do we mean by sort of multidimensional data or multidimensional space? So I will talk about that in this talk, but the problem we have in chemistry is there is a humongous chemical space of things we could make. So this number here, 10 to the 60, is the number of all the potential pharmacological molecules that are possible to be made. This is too many to make in the lifetime of the universe. Now of these, we've made, I can't quite remember the number from my top of my head, I think it might be 14 million of these molecules. But that is a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of what we need to explore. Even worse than that, we haven't explored this space particularly well systematically. We haven't spread all over the space, we haven't sampled randomly. What happens is people go into the lab and they tend to try and make molecules similar to the sort of molecules other people in their group make or their professor makes. So we've made inroads into this space, but there's a lot of empty space out there. And this is where machine learning comes in. So machine learning can help us explore this space and break out into new areas and find new types of chemicals. And also it can help organize it. So this talk is about mathematics and machine learning as applied to chemistry. And I'm going to go through, some of this stuff may seem quite obvious. I'm not quite sure how to pitch it, but I will go through all the aspects of dimensionality in chemistry. And I hope you indulge me for the first 5 or 6 slides because there's a bit of philosophy. Okay, so I'm starting the talk at the Renaissance. So the big thing that happened in the Renaissance is we discovered perspective. So if you look at the picture, I don't know if you can see my mouse here on the left, this is an example. This is where mankind basically figured out how to make a two-dimensional flat painting that looked three-dimensional. And the maths to figure all this out helped expand, well, basically expand the technology of the time. We got some other technologies around this time, such as the printing press, clocks, and for our purposes, science. So this is the same time that mathematics started to be written in a symbolic way and algebra started to be made. And also, this is when the first graphs were drawn. So I think it's quite interesting that when we started with three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional flat painting, we also started plotting two-dimensional data from two-dimensional space and the graphs we all know and love. And you can argue exactly when alchemy became chemistry and vice versa, well, not vice versa, when alchemy became chemistry, but this is about the time we started to see proper experimental science and what we properly recognize as chemistry. So I think that's quite interesting considering where we are right now. The late Victorian ages, this novel came out called Flatland. And this introduced the general populace to the idea of there being an extra spatial dimension. So we've got the 3 spatial dimensions we all know and deal with every day. And then there's the idea of the 4th one. And every talk on multidisciplinarity mentions this novel. I've never met, multidimensionality, sorry. I've never met anyone that's read it, which is why I have this little picture down here of Super Paper Mario. You see what's happening? This is a 2-dimensional character that is able to flip into the 3rd dimension in order to solve puzzles. So if you imagine you lived in a 2-dimensional world, you moved into a 3rd dimension, what would you see? That's the start of thinking about higher dimensions, because then you can start to ask the question of what would you see in a higher dimension? So if you lived in a 2D world and your 3D object interacted with it, you see this change in cross-section. That's what's going on here. And if you move into a higher dimensional world, you see some very strange things. So I'll just show you this clip again. If you see little Mario here, he's going to move into another dimension, an escape dimension, and solve the puzzle. Okay. I'm also going to mention some other ideas that were around at the time. Like I said, bear with me. I know this is moving away from chemistry. But the idea of a 4th spatial dimension came in art. So what's going on in these pictures here in Cubism is you've got a 3-dimensional image of a woman, a 3-dimensional person, and it's really two sort of viewpoints, or that three-dimensional object that have been stuck together, which you can see here. So that might be how three-dimensional objects would look from a four-dimensional viewpoint. And this is probably what you all expected me to start with, which was four-dimensional space of relativity, which is space-time, which sounds like, yeah, this is largely to do with physics, and I'm not sure how many people realize how much this comes into chemistry. For example, the color of gold and the liquid nature of mercury are related to relativistic effects. But it's also to do with how good lead acid batteries work, and it comes in NMR, in spin orbit coupling corrections for heavy atoms in NMR. So this isn't completely alien to us. And now based on that, where are we going now? So in the Renaissance, the understanding of how to represent three-dimensional data, sorry, three-dimensional space and two-dimensional data seemed to open up a lot of technologies. We've had 100 years of thinking about higher than 3 dimensions. Now, I've put string theory on here because it exists, but it really has nothing to do with the talk. What I think is important at the moment is that we have n-dimensional data, which allows us to do much more interesting, much more deeper analyses and find out more things. And we can only do that because of computers. So I'm quickly going to make a point that might be quite obvious, but it's worth repeating. So if we have two-dimensional data, so x and y, we can plot that in a two-dimensional space. So each data point, each point in the space has an xy coordinate, and we're saying where the data is in that space. That's quite obvious. When you get to multidimensional data, we can do the same thing. So if you have a vector, say, of values of data, then you can actually use that. Say it's 1,000 bits long, your vector, or there's 1,000 numbers in it. Then you can use that to pinpoint a position in a 1,000-dimensional space. So this is really what we're talking about. So switching between the data and the idea of the data being plotted in a multi-dimensional space. Okay, so this is the plan of what I'm going to talk about. So I'll start off going through the first 3 spatial dimensions and some ideas of how to choose the correct dimension. Then the 4th dimension is time. Then I will try and give you some simple intuitions about multidimensional space, so you can try and think about this. And then we move on to a sort of case study on how to work with multidimensional data and how modern machine learning algorithms do this. Okay. Okay, so 0, 1, 2, and 3 spatial dimension. Now, when talking about these things, there's a couple of slightly different concepts that get slightly conflated. So we have the dimension of space, as in a physical dimension you'd walk around. So we have 3D objects in a 4D world. This is the maths. This is less important for us, but it helps with understanding to think of geometrical shapes in these spaces. And we have the dimension of data. By dimension, we mean degrees of freedom. And then we have the dimension of the model. So if we're modeling things or trying to understand them, we often decide to choose a different dimension from the 3 dimensions that thing will live in. And this is a type of coarse graining, so we're only choosing the important dimensions in order to describe our system. There will be examples. So let's start with 0D. So a 0-dimensional object is a point. When it comes to data, the dimension of data, that's the single numbers. So just like the number 3. And this is where it comes in models. So nanoparticles and quantum dots are often described as being 0-dimensional conductors. That's what these things are here. So this is quite interesting because you can see there's a buckyball there. Now, if you're looking at a buckyball, say the vibrations of the buckyball or something, you'd do that in 3 dimensions. But if you're looking at its conductance as a material, you often tend to look at it as 0-dimensional. So this is for semiconductors. And over here, we see some Brownian motion, and here the atoms are just modeled as more or less points. So that's what I mean by modeling the dimension. So, okay. 1 dimension, this is much easier. So, so the dimension of space is a line or an arrow. So if you have one-dimensional data, you would have a list of numbers. You have 1 degree of freedom, which is x. This is a vector. And you see up here, it's been plotted, you know. Now, these sorts of plots aren't necessarily very useful for analyzing your data, but if you only have one dimension, then you can plot it on the x-axis like that. When it comes to models, when it comes to, say, conducting things, we have a conducting polymer there, we consider that to be one-dimensional. Carbon nanotubes are considered to be one-dimensional conductors because the most important dimension is along the line of the nanotube. And you can also think of molecules. This molecule can be modeled as one-dimensional. Obviously not if it's vibrating or distorting on the angle, but if you're describing the symmetry of that, it is similar to a rod, and you could describe it as sort of one-dimensional object. Okay, 2 dimensions. So the shapes we're getting at, these are 2D shapes. And if you have data, that means, as I said earlier, your space is defined by 2 dimensions. So each point in space has an x and a y coordinate. So our data is x versus y. And this is a matrix. So in terms of chemical models, this is surfaces. So generally, if you're modeling surface chemistry, you often, it depends, you may just treat it as what's happening on the surface rather than above it. Here we have a beta sheet, which can be modeled as a more or less flat thing. And benzene, for example, is a flat molecule. So if you're working in the 2D world, then you're thinking of things as flat. And finally, 3D. This is 3D objects. You get 3 dimensions of data, so you have an x, y, z coordinate at every point. So that's 3 degrees of freedom. And this gives you what's called a tensor. And I've got some nice, you know, it's not a computational chemistry talk if you don't have a spinning molecule. So I have some spinning molecules where you can see the 3-dimensional structure is very important. And it's also quite interesting to point out how I'm showing these here, because these are 2-dimensional pictures of 3-dimensional objects, and I'm using the 3rd dimension of time to give you an idea of the shape. So, okay. I should point out that when I wrote this talk, I did cut something out. So I'm not going to mention fractional dimensions here, which is where you can have dimensions between 1 and 2. This tends to be dendrimers and interesting sort of surface type effects. So I'm afraid that isn't in this talk. We're not doing fractal geometry, but you can try and model, it's the same sort of thing. You try and understand the dimension of your system that you're studying, and you might find it acts more like it's between, say, dimension 1 and 2, it's like 1.4 or whatever. Okay, choosing a dimensional space. So, okay, so here we're going to talk about how you might put chemical data into a computer. Now, at this point, there's a lot of discussion on what is the best way to input that data. And I think it's quite obvious to everyone in this field that there's not going to be a best way. It's a matter of what the problem is. And I also know that I think Professor Goodman's given a talk in this series, and he will go, I'm sure, into a lot of detail about this. So I won't go too much into it here. But I want to consider the problem in terms of the dimensionality we're using. So you can use something like a smile string, or this sort of string here, which is sort of a one-dimensional vector as an input. This could be something like a RD kit fingerprint or something like that, or what's called tokenized inputs. I don't want to go too much into that, but as a list of numbers, this can be a one-dimensional input. The risk of confusing slightly, you could say that that's, I think that's 16 numbers. You could say that's a point in 16-dimensional space. But here we're considering it's a vector, and thus it's a sort of one-dimensional set of data. I hope I haven't confused anyone there. You can switch back between the 2 input descriptions. And then, for example, we can have 2-dimensional inputs, such as a 2D structure. Now, these tend to be input as connection matrices, as a matrix that's 2-dimensional, and that's often used. And then we'd put that into a machine learning algorithm for whatever task we're doing. So I'm going to talk quite a lot about neural networks for this, but there are other ways. And then what we get out the other end is what's called a continuous learned embedding. Now, this is very cool. So this is actually a 4-dimensional space. So we've taken our input of all of our molecules over all chemical space, or over parts of chemical space, and we have embedded it into a smaller 4-dimensional space. That's basically how neural networks work, and I'll talk about this a bit later. Now, if you're thinking, what would you do with that? Say you were training a neural network to predict something, these numbers would then go to that prediction. Or if you were interested in making something like, so you've got a set of reactions, you want to try and find some other reactions you haven't looked at, you might explore this space here, okay? But some of the recent stuff I've been thinking about is how to get 3-dimensional data in. So for chemistry, depending on what you're doing, of course, but I think for trying to predict new drug targets or pay attention to chirality in terms of retrosynthesis, we really need to keep chirality. So we really need a 3D structure in order to keep chirality. So one thing you could do is you can put in a 3-dimensional structure into what's called a spherical or 3D neural network, which works just like a 2D neural network. The problem with this is, well, to be honest, there's not too much work in this direction yet. And they're quite slow because the best deep neural networks, which are the ones that have kind of caused the recent excitement in machine learning, tend to work best with 2-dimensional image data. So there's a lot of good neural networks to deal with 2D graphical data. And one way they work is they do data augmentation. So you get lots of pictures to train your neural network and you flip them, because a cat reflected in a mirror is still a cat. So you can increase the number of data you can use to train your neural network. And a very key point is that if you're training a neural network, more data is better. And if you can't have more data, then more and more and more data, like as much data as you can get. We're talking millions of data points. And a way to get that is data augmentation. Now, how obviously, any data augmentation that involves reflection is not useful for chemistry. So I'm pondering an input where you can take a 3-dimensional structure and convert it to a sort of 2-dimensional input that can be used with these graphical neural networks that retains its rotational symmetry and chirality. So this should be good, like perhaps as good as the 3-dimensional neural networks, which would be a lot quicker. But because we start originally with a 3-dimensional structure, we should hopefully keep the chirality and rotational symmetries that we know are useful for chemistry. So I'm just going to show you this sort of input. So what's happening here? So you see we've got benzene in the middle here. And I've put a shape around it, an icosahedron. That's what this shape is. And the idea is we encapsulate the molecule in a shape, an icosahedron. Then we imagine that at the center of the molecule there is a light. And this light shines light outwards onto the outside of the icosahedron and projects a shadow. And as you can see, okay, so once you've done that, you've projected a shadow onto the icosahedron. Now, 3-dimensional shapes can be unfolded, and it happens that an icosahedron has 60 different ways of unfolding it. It has 20 sides, you can unfold it in 60 different ways and make a 2-dimensional input. And the idea of doing that is that you now have, from one molecular structure, you have 60 different inputs. This isn't all 60. And this should work better with a neural network. And in fact, there are neural networks that are designed to work with icosahedral inputs. So we've gone from a 3-dimensional structure to a 2-dimensional net. And the net is the unfolding of this object. Now, the interesting thing about this is you can see some repeated patterns, which we do expect, given that benzene has a high degree of symmetry. Now, I'll be honest, there's going to be some fascinating work for me to do here on how the symmetry of the molecule relates to the symmetry of the icosahedron, so you could predict the nets. But at this point, we don't really need to know exactly how it works because we can actually just make these nets and put them into a neural network. Now, to kind of understand what's going on, I've put the picture from Picasso back up. So if you imagine looking at a woman in a chair, you walk all the way around her and take pictures and then unfold it. As Picasso imagined in this painting, that's exactly what we're doing here. So we're walking all the way around the benzene and sort of, taking pictures, but the light's in the middle of the benzene, okay? I'll give you another example. So this is Tamiflu, and we can put it inside a shape. So we've got an icosahedron there, but we can also make bigger, so you can divide the icosahedron to make these other shapes called icosaspheres. Icospheres. And the more times you divide it, the more like a sphere it gets. So what's happening here? So I've taken a single icosahedron or icosasphere and I've unwrapped it one of the 60 ways. And I've basically rotated the molecule inside as I've unwrapped it. So these animated GIFs here basically show what it looks like if you rotate the molecule inside the icosasphere. Now, I think they look pretty, and you might not quite be able to understand what's going on. And I should definitely point out that the hydrogens are a teal colour, not a white colour here. But hopefully you can see, especially if you look at the one down here, that there's certain patterns that sort of co-occur and certain movements that seem to co-occur. Now what this is showing the neural network, when this goes to the network, it's telling it something about the angles of the bonds and the symmetries and which atoms are close to each other. So this is exactly the information that we want the neural network to have. And hopefully has captured enough of the three-dimensional information in a nice 2D format to put in that it would make it easy for neural networks to learn. Now the point here is we're inputting two-dimensional data, but because we're inputting all the different rotations and all the different unwrappings, much like these graphs here, is actually three-dimensional now as it's two-dimensional plus time. And it should work for neural networks because they need lots of data. So this is augmenting the data. And these little pictures up here are just to show. So the ray casting, which is what this technique is, and ray tracing, which you may also have heard of. These are computer graphics terms, and they're exactly what the GPUs that are used in machine learning were actually designed for. So this sort of thing is incredibly fast. So as a method to put three-dimensional data into machine learning algorithms, it should be quite fast. But this is, I haven't done that yet. So this is the introduction of how we might put that in. Okay, I'm now going to move on to 4 dimensions, space and time. So this, I like art, you may have gathered. So if you ever heard of futurism, this is where they explored 3-dimensional objects with time. So this is a dog running, and you can see it hasn't got 100 legs, that's different time shots. And this is a woman walking down a staircase. However, we are actually able to do 4-dimensional manipulations now in the lab. So this is Dave Glowacki's lab at the University of Bristol, which is called the Intangible Realities Lab, and it makes this program the Reaper. And what we see this person here doing, this is Becca, is she's using a virtual reality simulation. Now, I would recommend, honestly, that everybody on this call borrow a VR headset from someone and try looking at molecules in it. The first time I saw a cell membrane in VR, I basically cried. It was so beautiful, and you can make it really big, and you're staring up at these molecules that are towering over you, and it's just really awe-inspiring to see these things you've been reading about and working with all your life and actually interact with them at that scale. Now what's going on here, I hope you can see that the atoms are moving. So this is a molecular dynamics simulation. So because she can actually see that protein in 3 dimensions and time, so this is 4-dimensional, so we can start to play with 4-dimensional chemistry. And what this is, as I said, a molecular dynamics simulation. It turns out that human beings are very good at seeing where molecules should bind, and we're better at finding the binding place than a general molecular dynamics simulation. You see how she can see where it is and fold the protein over the top. So this is a kind of a method to speed up finding useful information from molecular dynamics simulation by actually, you know, pushing the computer along the correct direction to get that information. Okay, this is my personal opinion. If you read anything about multidimensional space or 4-dimensional, you will be told that you cannot visualize or manipulate 4-dimensional and higher spaces. And that annoys me because I think it means people don't try. We may not be able to properly visualize 4-dimensional spaces, but we can have some intuition about it, I think. And often people say all you need to do is learn the maths, but I think it's worth trying to understand how these things work. And that's also why I put the art in at the start. You know, I mean, artists have been trying to understand how these spaces might look or work. So I think we should perhaps be able to do a bit more than say that it's impossible. So here's some examples of 4-dimensional data. So this is a 4-dimensional object being rotated in 3D to try and give you a sense of it. Down here is a cubic slice of 5-dimensional NMR data. So perhaps if you're skilled at NMR, you can look at several of these cubic slices and start to understand and think about the data in 5D. This plot here, this is 4-dimensional data. We've got height, weight, and it's a blood pressure plot, so systolic and diastolic. So you are thinking about 4 dimensions there. And similarly here, especially when you get into this design of experiments, and you end up with like 20 plots, you're really starting to deal with high dimensional data. This is just to remind me of this slide. I mentioned computer games earlier, I showed you one. I've played a couple of computer games where you manipulate a 4-dimensional object. I couldn't find the clip, I'm afraid. So for example, you might walk through a door and then go back through the door and you come out in a different place. This is what you'd expect if it was a 4-dimensional object. I've also seen one where you had to rotate an object, and it was 3D in the game, but it was actually a 4D object, and you got a different view of the object whether you rotated it to the left or rotated it all the way around 4 times to the left, all the way around 4 times to the right. Now, the reason I mentioned this is I got stuck on that in the game until I realized it was a tesseract, but generally most people don't know that and they're able to do the game. Why? Because human beings are able to learn to manipulate things. We're able to learn the rules of a system. Even if we cannot actually visualize the 4D object, we can use it. And that's important because obviously if humans can learn how to do it, machine learning algorithms can as well. Okay, so now I'm going to try and give you some intuitions about how high dimensional space works. So this is more the maths end. I'm trying to do it with some metaphors. Okay, so let's start with some simple objects. So this is a 2-dimensional object. We have a square here that's spinning around its middle, and then we have a rectangle that's spinning on the vertical there. Okay, we move the square up to 3 dimensions. We're all familiar with this. We have a cube, and again, spinning. Okay, so what happens if we move to 4 dimensions? So that's what this thing is here on the right. This is called a tesseract or a hypercube. It's a 4-dimensional hypercube, so it's sometimes called a 4-cube. And what's going on here is you're not actually seeing a cube going through another. It's a solid object rotating. What's happening is there's a 4th dimension to this object. So each of these angles here that you're seeing they are actually 90 degrees in 4 dimensions. It's just this is a projection of a 4-dimensional object into a 3-dimensional space. And in fact, it's lots of different projections. That's why it's changing. It's different angles. It's like you're walking around the 4-dimensional object, taking a 3-dimensional picture. Just like this cube is spinning because you've walked around a cube, taking a 2D picture and you put them together. Another way of thinking of it is how you unfold these objects. So a 3-dimensional cube can be unfolded into a 2D net. I mentioned nets earlier with the icosahedron unfolding. This is the same thing. We have a solid object, we can unfold it. Now the net of a hypercube, a tesseract, is this shape. So whereas the square is 6 squares stuck together, so the cube is 6 squares stuck together, a hypercube is 8 cubes stuck together. And just because I thought it'd be nice to point it out, this has been considered and understood in art. But this continues, so as you go higher into high dimensions. So what's going on here? You've got a line segment, and then a square, and that's a cube viewed side point on. And you can continue, there's the tesseract, the 5 cube, the 6 cube. Now the point of this is as you add more dimensions, you get more corners, more lines, more sides, and more squares. So space gets more complicated. That's what this little graph down here is. The red is the points, the blue is the lines, and the black is the faces. The main point is that these numbers are huge. So they are taking off very quickly. So, and if you think about it, so data-wise, say you gather 8 points of data, you know, you're down in, you've got, I had it the wrong way around, that's the points. You have, if you had 8 points of data, sorry, if you had 8-dimensional data, so you have 8 things you're gathering data about, you would need 2,000 points to actually have one in every direction of your space, okay? I've got some more examples here. So Gaussians, we all understand that. So this is a 1-dimensional Gaussian. So if you think about it, if you have something distributed in 1D, with a Gaussian, most of the mass of the distribution, so if they were points, most of the mass of the distribution's in the middle. I think we all know that. 2D, same thing. So this is a 2-dimensional Gaussian distribution. Most of the points are in the middle. We would expect the, if we sampled a point randomly, we'd expect it to be most likely here. Same 3-dimension, still in the middle. What happens if we go to high dimensions, so n dimensions? It's weird. Once you get to a high dimension, the Gaussian distributions are like soap bubbles. Most of the points are on the edge rather than the center. So it's the opposite of what you'd expect. So if you start to think of higher dimensional Gaussians, you'd probably have a picture like this or this in your head, and it's the opposite way round. So most of the mass is on the edge. Because there are so many dimensions, because I pointed out the number of points of our hypercube in higher dimensions gets bigger and bigger. You imagine if you put things on that, points on that, you need a lot of points just to get in all to distribute it into all the dimensions. It doesn't leave many to put in the middle. Couple more ideas. This is very similar. If you have a sphere, unit sphere and distribution of unit radius, high dimension, it's mostly on the edge. This one, so here is a 2-dimensional version. So we have a 2-dimensional sphere, which is a circle with radius 1, and a 2-dimensional cube, which is a square with length 1. You see the square is almost entirely, well, it is entirely within the circle. In 4 dimensions, the edges of the square, which is now a hypercube, touches the edges of the hypersphere. If you go higher than that, the edges of the hypercube stick out most of the mass. So if you filled the square with points, with data, most of those data points are outside the circle. So it's the opposite way around what we expect from 2 or 3 dimensions. And down here, so if you see you have data in 1 dimension, you can see that the data is sort of clustered. There's chunks of data close to each other. In 2D, it's a bit more spread out. In 3D, it gets even more spread out. Okay, so there's some other ways to think about it. So if you're interested in random walks are used in modeling things such as rotaxanes threaded onto polymers and polymers in general. So the thing that's interesting to me anyway about random walks is you can get cues in random walks. So if you're trying to understand a one-dimensional system with several walkers, they can get stuck behind each other. So something we all understand, having stood in a queue for the post office. In 2D, first you can see the random walk, there's more space. And secondly, you tend not to, you can get stuck in 2D, but if you imagine again, you're in the queue for the post office, you can move out of the one dimension of the queue into the second dimension, sneak around, come back in. So you can use that to avoid the queue. You'll get tutted at, of course, 3 dimensions. Now, the interesting thing is, as the dimensions increase, you have these extra escape dimensions, which is a great term. And this allows the walkers to escape, and that means you can't get cues in higher dimensions. I like the term escape dimensions because the computer game I showed you earlier, you saw Mario escaping into the 3rd dimension and coming back. This is exactly what's happening. And you can also not tie knots in dimensions greater than 3. So, and what's the point of all of this? So here we have an animation of going from dimension 0, 1, 2, 3, and looking at the volume, the number of regions we get, okay? So, okay, point, we have 1 region. It spreads to a line. Let's imagine there's tenths in that, so that's 10 line segments. When we have a square, that's 100 chunks of that. Cube, we're getting up to 10 by 10 by 10, and tesseract, we're getting up to 10,000. So as the dimensions expand, there is more space, more regions of that space for your data to get in, which means your data gets spread out. So that's the main insight from all of this, is that multidimensional data is more spread out in multidimensional space than you would expect from your understanding of lower dimensional data. And that's why it's weird. Okay, so I'm going to work through a way with dealing with this, so working with multidimensional space. So really quickly, so the overview of machine learning algorithms. You have your unsupervised learning. This is where you don't know what the outcome is. So you're asking the computer if there are any patterns in your data. You don't know at the start what your pattern should be. So use something called PCA, which I'm going to talk about, and also clustering algorithms, such as k-means. You have your supervised learning algorithms, which is where neural networks come in. And then you have reinforcement learning, which is basically you have an agent in the world interacting and learning, as it says there, from actions and rewards. I'm not going to talk about that at all because this isn't really used in chemistry much at the moment. Okay, but I am going to talk about coordinate transforms. So in a coordinate transform, you change from one set of coordinates to another. So with Cartesian to spherical coordinates, I'm sure everyone on here has done this. The point P is in 3-dimensional space here, and that point is in the same place, regardless of whether you describe it in X, Y, Z, Cartesian coordinates, or R, theta, phi, spherical coordinates. Now, one of these coordinate systems might be more useful for your problem. So that's why you might do it. You might change from Cartesian to spherical if you were describing spherical objects, for example. Okay. So I want to talk about generalized coordinates. So this is a very practical problem of Cartesian to generalized coordinates for the practical problem of me leaving work and going to the pub and giving some directions, okay? Now, assuming that Bristol is flat, which I know it is, assuming it's flat and can be described in 2 dimensions, I could give someone an XY coordinate of where they are and give them the XY coordinate of where the pub is. Those are localized coordinates, as you can see, because they're localized here and here, and you could use that to find the way. A generalized coordinate is, for example, St. Michael's Road, which is this road that goes up here. Generalized just means it's spread out over space, as you can see the road is. And the generalized coordinate for the directions is go up St. Michael's Road and stop at the pub, okay? I'm going to give a more chemical example now. This should all be very familiar to you. This is where we use generalized coordinates. So for example, let's say I have water molecule and my water molecule is moving, for example, in a molecular dynamics simulation, and it's bouncing around. Now I can describe all of the movement of that molecule in the simulation using 9 coordinates. So the XYZ of the first hydrogen, the XYZ position of the second hydrogen, and the XYZ of the oxygen, and obviously which point of time we're at. So that's 9 local coordinates. They're called local because they're centered on the atoms. We can also come up with a generalized coordinate. The generalized coordinate is spread over the entire molecule. And as chemists, there are 3 of these that we care about for water. Symmetric bond stretch, asymmetric bond stretch, and bond angle bend, which you can see up in this animation over here. Now, the 9 coordinates, the generalized coordinates, can describe the motion and the movement of a water molecule exactly as you can with Cartesian coordinates. But it's more interesting to us as chemists because we care about these bond stretches and angle bends because they turn up in IR. Now, notice that if, as we do as chemists, we ignore the translations of rotations when thinking about IR, then we are coarse-graining the system. So that means we're throwing away some information because the most important information is in this for our task. Whereas if we threw away 6 coordinates, the local coordinates, would actually not have much that's very useful to us. Okay, so principal coordinate analysis. This is a coordinate transform to a generalized coordinate. Now, the reason I just showed you the map and the water example is that most people seem not to understand principal component analysis. So the principal component analysis is really just the vibrations of your data set. That's all we're doing. We're trying to find out what is the vibrations of our data set. The technical term is that it organizes it into components, and the first component has the largest standard deviation or variance of your data set. The second one has the second largest, etc. But just think of it as vibrations. And you can use this to coarse grain your data. So this picture of the waterfall in the start, I've done a PCA of that picture, and then I recombined the components starting with the first one, added them one by one, and you'll see that you get the gross features to begin with, the sort of blurry outline of the waterfall, and then as you add more and more PCA, you get more and more finer detail. Okay, so on to my example. Let's say you have, you go around 3 different vineyards and you do some analysis of the wine and you gather some data. So you've gathered some analyte data of what's in your wine. So if you look down here, we have alcohol content, malic acid content, magnesium amount, total phenols, flavonoids, color intensity, hue. There are 13 different analytes here, okay? So this is what I mean about 13-dimensional data, because there are 13 different dimensions on which you're measuring your data. So this one here is 0, this is your first glass of wine. Number 1 is your second glass of wine, okay? Now the task we're going to try and do here is we're going to take this data and see if from these the values for these on these 13 analyte dimensions, whether we can figure out which vineyard the wine came from. These aren't the original vineyards, and the original data, they're all quite close to each other. So there was a difference between them, but they weren't huge. Okay, so this is where principal component analysis comes in. So there are several ways we can use it. One common way is to actually produce pretty pictures of multidimensional data. This is often done because papers are printed in 2D. So why this works. So if you take principal components, and this graph down here is small, but as I said, it organizes your data based on the amount of variance. So the first principal component contains 40% of the variance in your data set. The second is 20, and you see it drops off like that. So most of the variance in your data is in the first 1, 2, 3, or 4 components. Now, as I described earlier, we have just changed the data. It's a coordinate transform, so it's the same data, it's just been reorganized. So it means that if you plot your PCA1 against PCA2, you're plotting about 60% of the variance in your data set. Okay? Now, this is a projection. So we have a multi-dimensional data, and we've projected it down onto 2 dimensions. And there are several ways to do this. PCA is only one of them. There's also multidimensional scaling and TSNE, which is stochastic neighbor embedding. You may see these. And now the thing about projections is encapsulated over here. So projections can be very illuminating, such as the one at the bottom. We have a complex 3-dimensional shape, but the 2D projection shows a simple pattern. Or it can be misleading, like the one on the top. We have a 3-dimensional system of someone's hand and the distant sun, but the 2D projection makes it look like the sun is small and held between the fingertips. So bear in mind when you do this, you won't necessarily know which of these you have, okay? But anyway, so we've projected our data down, and it looks possibly encouraging because by eye we can see there's possibly a cluster here, possibly a cluster here, possibly a cluster here. We're looking for 3 clusters because there were 3 vineyards, but okay. So what do we do? So what we tend to do in PCA is we actually start to cluster, when we do our PCA, we then do something called a clustering algorithm. So we're looking for patterns in the data. So now we look for clusters. So if you see down here on the left is the ground truth. There's green, orange, and purple. And the clusters I thought I could see there, and there do seem to correlate to the vineyards. So we should be able to find them using our algorithm. Now, normally we don't have the actual ground truth. Okay. Another thing to note, there are some encroaching points here. Okay, so we first try and cluster in 1 dimension using the first PC. So I've plotted PCA1 against PCA2, but we asked the clustering algorithm to cluster only based along the x coordinate, and this is the result we get. So it's colored the points based on whether it thinks they're a separate cluster. Okay, it's not too bad. We add in our second principal component, so we allow the clustering algorithm to use the y-axis, and as you see, it clusters it pretty well. So it's found the 3 clusters, and that's using 60% of the variance in the data set. Okay, now we move on to using 3 principal components. So we've only got 2 plotted here, but we're doing the cluster in 3 dimensions. And what you can see is all of these red points are in the same cluster, all these green points are in the same cluster, but when we project it down, the red overlaps the green there. But in 3-dimensional space, they don't overlap. And this includes 70% of the variance, and we've got this point right, which is actually one of the ones in that cluster. So this is working quite well. Okay, so this is where using our projection has helped, and rearranging our data has helped. It's illuminated. Okay, so this is the most important slide of this bit, so let's go through this slowly. Down on the left, as I said, is the ground truth of the actual labels for the wine samples, okay? Now, if we take all 13 all 13 coordinates of the PCA, so if I have 13 dimensions of analyte data and I do a PCA on it, I have 13 PCA components. And before I was coarse graining, I was using 1, 2, and 3 components, and I got a good answer. Here we use all 13, so we've lost no data. As you can see, it's more or less right. It makes a few more mistakes than when we used free PCAs, core components. And that's because when you add more principal components, you're adding more small, fine adjustments, and that's probably your noise. So this is why PCA is used in coarse graining, is you take, if you want the big variance in your data, if you think that's the important point, you want to throw away the small variance, because the big variance is just signal, small variance is your noise. Okay? Now, if you look what's happened here, here we have used PCA to plot the data. So here it's only used as a visualization method, because we found when we plotted PCA1 against PCA2, it did show you the clusters. But now we're plotting the data that has been clustered in a higher dimension. So this is all of the data in a 13-dimensional space. And this is how it's clustered. Now, this isn't really wrong. Those clusters are there in the higher dimensional space. It just, you know, it just doesn't actually match what we were hoping to find from our data. And this shows an important point. If you do start doing clustering or any machine learning in a higher dimensional space, it doesn't project down the way you'd expect. As you can see, the blue is spread all over here, you know. So firstly, this projection isn't really helping us see what's going on. You know, this is a confusing one. And secondly, it hasn't really helped sort out our data. So what's going on? Okay, so I showed you that in higher dimension, the data is further apart. And it's less clustered, there's more space. And in lower dimensions, it's easier to cluster your data. So what PCA is actually doing is it rearranges your data, it reorganizes it into a space of the same size, but the data is now clustered more closely together in lower dimensions. As I said, the first principal component has 40% of your data. That's much closer, that's much easier to cluster. So that's often why this works. So one thing that machine learning algorithms do is they're able to cope with high multidimensional data, but when they're successful, they do tend to reorganize it and move it to a subspace in that space. Okay, more on this. So yeah, principal component analysis organizes the data in a useful way, and this can be used to reduce dimensionality. Okay. Neural networks and lower dimensional manifolds. Similar sort of thing. So a neural network is supervised learning algorithm. It's based vaguely on how the brain works. You give it data, it learns connections between units, and it hopefully predicts what's going on with your data. Okay, so you tend to use it in classification, like what is this? Yeah. So this is how a neural network's trained. So we have a neural network, and let's say we want to separate out, we've got a reaction and we've tried some catalysts on it. And the green ones are catalysts that have been really good, and the brown ones are catalysts that have been really bad. And what we want to do is we want the machine to predict us some new catalysts that would hopefully be really very good. So we train the neural network with our data, and what we want to do is we want to separate the good from the bad in some way, probably along our embedding dimension. Now I put this up because this probably looked familiar to chemists. So as you train the neural network, this error goes, that's drawn the way around, that's NG. Okay, the error is actually getting better when you go down. Okay, so as you train it, there's less error. So ignore the numbers there. And this is it from the top. So we've got space that maybe looks like that. Our neural network trains, and it puts the points here and here. Now this would be great because now we've got a dimension here that separates great catalysts from bad catalysts, and these are mediocre over here. So we know we want to kind of explore this space, okay? Now, here is a different type of view. So I showed you earlier, we had inputs into our embedding algorithm here, that may or may not be a neural network. And we get this continuous learned embedding that is a 4-dimensional space in this case. You'd normally use bigger than 4 dimensions. Now, it happens that when neural networks do this, they embed the data nicely. Okay, so what do I mean by nicely? Firstly, they're embedded in what's called a manifold, a lower dimensional manifold. What that means is it's a space that's smaller than the space you're in. What that simply means, so in 3 dimensions, a smaller sort of shape or space would be a 2-dimensional space. So this is a 2-dimensional manifold in a 3-dimensional space. So just imagine a piece of paper and you curve it slightly. You know, the paper can still be described as a 2D space, but it's been curved with respect to the axes. Now, because neural networks do that, they're reducing the dimensionality of the problem, which makes it easier. They also cluster similar things together. So this could be, say, you know, our good catalyst over here and our bad catalyst over here. So it does remove some of the problems of multidimensionality by clustering them on the manifold, okay? And the whole point of doing this is that once you figure out roughly where this manifold is, you want to explore it. So you've got this embedding, you want to start, say, this is, say, I don't know, this is a really good catalyst. You might want to explore around here, okay? And one thing to pay attention to is you could see the variance here. So because it's a 2-dimensional space, there's a lot of variance along the X and the Y because it's roughly aligned. So you want to explore by going a big step along X, maybe a big step along Y, but no big steps along Z because you want to stay close to the other points. Whereas this one, if you assume you have sort of spherical data, you would take equal steps in all directions and you end up over here, which is far from what you've seen, so it's probably not going to be very good. Okay, now the problem is we don't know where that manifold is. We know there is one. We just see this. You just get the points on this space. And one way to try and deal with that is to sort of put in all of the data that you've got and map it. So again, we're clustering it. Although here using hypercuboids rather than circles. Because this new space here is flatter. So we don't want to use circles or spheres because it's not the same in all directions. It's not spherical type data, it's a flatter type manifold. So what's going on here? So the main point here is that neural networks do something very similar to the PCA at the basic level. So they are reducing the dimensionality of the data because they've moved it from that giant space to a manifold, and they've organized it in a useful way. So I know for a fact that there are many mathematicians out there working on sparse data sets to try and make new algorithms that can deal with highly multidimensional data in its purest form. But most of the breakthroughs in machine learning, most of the machine learning that we use reduces the problem. Now, it doesn't reduce it all the way down to 2 or 3 dimensions, and neither should it, but it does reduce it from the size we have. Okay, so what are the conclusions? Our chemical data is inherently multidimensional. We know quite a lot about an individual molecule. You know, there's lots of things we could write down about it and what it does. And if we start to say, if you have a solvent, you have its acidity, its basicity, its melting point, its boiling point, all of that, and then you have all of the molecule, all of the reactions it works in. That's a very large data set in terms of dimension. And we also have big data, so we have a lot of points. Multidimensional data can be manipulated nicely by modern computers. This is the breakthrough that's happening at the moment. We couldn't do this with pen and paper. It's too arduous. We can now do it with computers. However, the multidimensional space that our data live in does not behave how we expect from lower dimensions. Basically, it's more spread out, and the geometry doesn't work the way we expect. The best way to think of it, I think of, is bubbles. Lots of bubbles and lots of gaps, like foam or something like that. Our data is like the soap bubble foam. And we can work with the original multidimensional space, and that's fine if it's quite small. But it's usually a good idea to use machine learning techniques to reorganize and reduce that space. So as I said, the PCA reorganizes the data, and then you can throw away some of your components to reduce the space. The neural networks are usually very, very large spaces, but the data is always organized nicely on a smaller dimensional space. And it's also a nice space because it tends to be smooth rather than scrunchy. And that's my last slide. And I just thought I'd put up where I work, which is the Center for Doctoral Training, Technology Enhanced Chemical Synthesis. And actually the K-means example is something our PhD students do to learn Python and machine learning at the start. So I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.